There. I don't know what I did.
Oh, yeah, that was good. The Zoom screen was nice.
Oh, very nice.
That's pretty.
So for those of that just joined us, we just discussed that soil is nothing more than a medium of organic and inorganic material that supports plant growth, but it's very variable in drainage, fertility, and ability to hold water and nutrients. And this picture shows that. You can see the different colors out in that field, and those would actually be different soil properties being reflected by the different growth of, in this case, is this prior to being planted, it's what's just naturally growing out in that field early in the season. So when we're talking about soil formation, we're looking at parent material, organisms, climate, topography, and the key point is the time it takes to create 1 inch of soil, which is about 500 years. So we talk about conserving our soils, and it's a key to maintain our properties that have actually been developed over centuries. How is a parent material formed? Different ways. In northern Indiana, it's in many cases, it's the glacial till or the glacier event that started our soil development. We have sands and silts that blew away as the water ran off the melting glacier, and as it formed flat areas, the wind blew over those flat areas as they dried out and picked up the finer sand and the silts went further than the sand. So those are the 2 types of soils we formed, was sands blown by the wind and then losses soils where the silts finally hit the soil and created those type of soils. Alluvium is actually occurring as we speak. That's as we have soil erosion where that material collects, that creates a new parent material to develop a soil. So those are actually more recent events and ongoing as we don't control soil erosion. Outwashes and lacustrine areas. The outwash is as the melting waters slow down, the heavier materials, the gravel and the sand settle to the bottom. And lacustrine areas actually is old lake beds where the fine material settled out. The clay and silts make up more of those soils properties. In Ohio, there's a huge area that's high in clay content because it used to be an old lake bed. Weathered bedrock actually occurs in southern Indiana where they didn't have as many glacial events. We have calcium limestone that we even mine in the state of Indiana, down in southern Indiana, and that's actually the parent material for a lot of those soils down there. And then I just want to note that tillage construction can greatly alter soil properties from what was formed over time. Looking at organisms, if you get in the prairie soils, what we call the A layer, which I'll define in a minute, can be feet deep, and that tends to be where the organic matter accumulates, because for grasses, prairie grasses, what dies every year is most of the root system, so that builds up organic matter in the soil. Here in Indiana, 85% of our soils were covered with trees, so we have a shallow A layer or organic layer, because as the leaves fall down, that's the real source of the organic matter that builds up in our soil. So it doesn't tend to develop a very deep or A layer or organic layer. Climate also has an impact, but let me show you this next slide. That's an example of a andesol, which is a typical Indiana soil that's not very deep in the A layer, that upper darker colored part of the soil. And that's resulting from being mainly a forest in the state of Indiana.
Is that andesol?
Yeah.
The A layer?
Andesol is actually a type of soil group. So this andesol is a title for a lot of different soil types. that fall under that category. So just as we classify plants, we classify soils into larger groups, then break them out from there. And this would be an andesol group. And then topography is another factor that, going back to climate. In Canada, they have soils that we call true peat soils because their growing season is so short that the organic matter doesn't even break down. So when we buy peat to put into our garden beds, it's actually somewhat undecayed dead plant material that's undecayed because of the short growing season in the cooler climates. In warmer climates, we tend to have soils that are lower in organic matter because the soil biology stays active, breaking down and recycling the organic matter at a much rapid pace. A good example of that is in Florida, where there was swamps. When they drained the swamps, the organic soils tend to dissipate pretty quickly once it's aerated, and the soil microbes are able to recycle that organic matter and release it and utilize it for into the environment. You can see in this photo, topography is what I was talking about with where erosion will tend to move some of the nutrients and organic matter down to the lower areas. So the hillsides will tend to be soils with lower organic matter compared to the terraces and the upper flatlands. So topography can impact the type of soils that we have in our landscape as well. So if you have a lower area, they'll tend to accumulate a little bit more organic matter compared to the high areas in the landscape. So the climate, the topography, the parent material, and time actually all are factors that develop our soils. And what we're really interested is the depth of the soil, not just the soil surface. In this photo, you can see that the organic matter is at a higher level of the upper soil, and then it goes into a developed soil we call a B layer, then down to the parent material, which is what was aged over centuries to create the B and A layers. Just a quick photo. The importance of soil type. You can see the corn has issues and has fired the lower leaves on the one soil type, and as it transitioned to another soil type that has better water holding capacity and a little more organic matter, you can see the corn is doing much better. And this is happening in our landscapes as well. We want to remember that what soils are is that mineral component, which in most Indiana soils is 45% or even higher of the material making up the actual soil particles. Then air and water. We always want to remember the roots need air just like we need air. And also they need enough water to be able to maintain their plant metabolic functions. In this picture, the organic matter is represented at 5%, and in mineral soils, that actually would be high. In organic soils, that would be like the histosol series, which I'll show you a picture of those as well, is 20% organic matter at least. And if it's over 40% organic matter in a soil, then it would be called peat. And so actually those peat bogs in Canada and other cool climates that they harvest would actually be 40% organic matter and in that soil makeup.
Can you have too much air? You know how we till up our ground for the gardening part? Is that pro or con?
Yeah, I'll touch upon that, but yes, tillage will lower the organic matter in the soil because you're aerating it when you till, so you have to be doing activities to add back organic matter to keep it active. One aspect of organic matter, there's actually two types of organic matter. It's which is just dead plants and animal material in your soil is what organic matter is. And as it ages, it'll lose some of the activity for the soil to be more biologically active. So we want an active biological soil because that is healthy for the plants.
But they don't, farmers don't use, like, they use different things now that it's supposed to help that. I never see them go out and put cow manure or horse manure or anything on it anymore.
Somebody was, because they had manure smell.
That
They-
For miles and
Yeah.
miles.
So we're talking about things we'll be talking in the next couple of sessions, so I'll get back to the soil basics. So this is our horizons that develop in the soil. Again, you've seen that in prior photos. But the A horizon is where the higher organic matter level is, higher biological activity up in that area. Then we drop down to the B horizon, and that's where the clay tends to settle. So it's a little different texture, structure in many soils. And then the C horizon, again, is a parent material. So we talk about these horizons when we're talking about soils and how they've been formed. Color is a good indicator of organic matter content, and drainage conditions is another connection to color. Organic matter content is good, and we'll talk about how it adds to the cation exchange capacity. And it's also like having a slow release fertilizer in your soil. So organic matter is a good component. And dark color indicates a higher percentage of organic matter, or decaying plant and animal matter is what organic matter is again. So you can see the one soil would have a higher organic matter content in this photo. It also can be an indication of poor drainage, because the iron in the soil, when it's reduced and not oxidized, is a dark color. So we will rate soils based upon drainage properties. When we reach a area that is starting to show reduced iron in the soil, changing the color to a darker color. It's not always uniform when it's just seasonal flooding that is in that higher poor drainage area in the soil, but the modeling of gray in the soil is an indication that we're getting into poor drainage at that level. And that will impact what we can grow our soils. So this is a histosol series soil that's here in Marshall County, which is we call it's an organic soil because it's at least 20% organic matter. These soils were needed to be drained to be productive because they developed organic matter because it was an anaerobic environment where they were fairly well flooded all season long. And that's why even in Florida, you can have a histosol type soil if it's always flooded. I just put this in. This is a soil we don't tend to have in Napanee. This is an old soil that's very oxidized, so that just makes the color brighter. You tend to see a soil like this more in Georgia, in a southern state that didn't have the glacier events that we had, so their soils are older than ours. But you can see the bright color showing that it's a well oxidized soil with the iron being oxidized versus reduced. So soil texture is what gives us some of our soil properties, which is a mixture of three small particles that are inorganic, which is sand, silt, and clay. The texture influences the water holding capacity, water infiltration, ease of tillage, seedbed preparation, and nutrient holding capacity. So as we go in size, it's sand, silt, and clay. Sand is 0.2 to 0.05 millimeters. Bigger than that would be called gravel. And it would be gritty, like on a sand beach. Silt, being a smaller particle, has more of a floury texture to it, 0.05 to 0.002 millimeters. And clay, we all know clay. We've all played with Play-Doh or clay type, real clay products. And we know it's sticky and it's less than 0.02 millimeters. Now, when you get a high clay content soil, that will definitely have a impact on soil properties. But when these three are mixed together, that determines the type of structure our soil has. So coarse soils tend to have a higher percent of sand in them. So there'd be sands, loamy sand or sandy loams that are going to have, tend to have better drainage because of the larger particle size that the sand attributes to it. A medium soil is loam. If you have a loam soil, like a Napanee loam that I grew up in my youth, it's our best mixture of these inorganic minerals to form a soil, and we'll get to that a little bit more, and silt loam, so that's a medium soil. And then the fine soils are the clay loams, silty clays, loams, and silty clay and clays. And that's, in these soils, they become to be overpowered by the clay content in the soil. So when we're looking at the loam, like my Napanee loam soil, it's good for agriculture and garden soils, good water holding capacity, and it's soil roughly equal parts of sand, silt, and clay. A silt loam, rich in silt, little sand, feels like flour, will have a high water holding capacity and low permeability. And then like a clay loam, due to that clay influence, is very hard when dry, sticky when wet, and can be molded. High water holding capacity and low permeability. So as we go from like a low, it has one impact. If we shift in the silt, it goes a low, changes the properties. And then of course, whenever clay increases in proportion to the other mineral components, it overpowers the soil properties. Just showing a picture of what it looks like. The big item is still smaller than 2 millimeters, so that's coarse sand, and there's fine sand, which would tend to blow to create that sand blow in the soils. And then you can see how tiny actually the clay is larger than it would be in proportion to the silt, just because we want you to see tiny little dots and point word clay to it. So one way we can determine texture in the upper soil easily is just by feel. So sand will create no ribbon when we add some water to it, to where it's like a wet sponge consistency when we add water to the soil. But when it's sand soils will not form a ribbon when we work it between our fingers, and it will feel gritty. A soil that is loam will only produce a ribbon maybe an inch long, but due to the low clay content in it, it won't produce a very long ribbon. So that would be a loam soil. If it can produce a 1 to 2 inch ribbon, that would be a clay loam. And then a clay soil, you could produce a 2-inch ribbon by working the soil in your hand and making it, again, the moisture of a kind of a wrung out sponge, and then working it through your fingers. So if you're a stressed person, using this fill texture to determine your soil type or your soil structure, your components, is a good way to relieve stress. And again, the infiltration is an important aspect of this soil texture, soil structure. So as we move from a loamy sand, you can see that it will move into the soil fairly rapidly. This is infiltration rate of centimeters per hour. So in 1 hour, I get 12 inches of movement. And then with silty loam, it's not as quick to infiltrate as what a loamy sand would be. And then when you add the clay component, it greatly slows down the infiltration into the soil, creating runoff situations. If you've ever lived on clay soil, which I have, eroded loam soil down to the clay layer, you have like 3 days, it seems like, to do anything with the soil. It's either too wet or too hard. Structure is the cluster or aggregates of those soil components that we talked about to form soil particles. Soil structures affects water and air movement into the soil profile, as well as root growth. Types of structures we'll review. This is just showing you that the difference between just the tightness of your soil when you have sand versus silt. The blue ring around it is water adhering to the soil particle. But you can see that in a sand soil, you're going to have more pore space between the particles as compared to, in this case, the smallest particle, which is silt. So the silt is going to reduce your ability for water to infiltrate and move through your soil profile. Back to soil structure. So granular, it tends to be in the A layer. Good organic matter in that layer helps to create this nice granular structure that allows for infiltration of water to move into your soil, so it reduces the prospect of having runoff, which will create erosion off of your soil. We get down in the B layer, particles form together to create what we call this subangular or blocky structure. Again, between these structures will allow movement of roots and water and nutrients. This is not a good structure to have in your soil. This is platy structure. You can see in that upper picture, it looks like plates laid on top of each other. And this is usually the result of compaction that created this type of structure, and they'll impede movement of even roots down into your soil. So let alone water. It's not a good thing to create. That's why we got to control traffic patterns and consciously think about not creating platy structure on our soils. So again, in the upper soil profile, crumb or granular soil structure is desired. Platy structure is not. And then down into our soil, blocky, we can even get prismatic type columnar structure as well. And as long as it's not clay in between those columnar structures, water and nutrients can move through that soil as well. This is just showing you water infiltration that can occur depending on the type of structure that we have present. So with single grains, like a sand soil that doesn't have a lot of structure, or granular structure in soils that are loam soils with good organic matter, we get good water infiltration into the soil. So when we get our 7/10 of an inch of rain that I got at my house today, the water goes in the soil and doesn't run off. As we go into blocky and prismatic type structures, it does slow down the water infiltration in the B layer, which is not all bad, because when we need water in the A layer and in the B layer for plant growth, that will slow the movement of the water, so that may retain some of it in that area for the plant to use. What's bad is when we get massive structure or platy structure, it will not allow the water and nutrients to penetrate down into the soil profile, and it can even prevent roots. One time in southern Indiana, we leveled out research plots, and by the time I had my training clinic, I'd call all the soybeans. This was in southern Indiana. There's a community down there called Lagodi, so I called it a Lagodi soil because all the roots formed an L. It hit that platy structure, and instead of going on down, it made a right angle growth because it couldn't penetrate the compaction. So then the good thing is that we have some macropores. Worms that actually tunnel can help make nice openings that go down into our soil. And then root channels, that's why cover crops can be advantageous as well, to create root channels that crops we grow later can follow down and move down into the soil. The micropores or smaller pores are responsible for water holding capacity, hold water against the force of gravity. So that's our water that's available to our crops, mainly in clay and silt soils. So like a common soil in Marshall County, a Risdale soil that I have in my property, you go down about 28 inches, you'll hit a clay layer. So that helps to hold some water in that upper soil profile for the plants that I'm growing. So how to improve your soil? We'll talk more about this, but incorporating organic matter that helps build good soil structure always will help improve the soil in that manner. And it also will help the soil improve its soil water holding capacity, nutrient source as it breaks down and is recycled by the soil organisms. And it actually will help transition soil organisms into more positive organisms that benefit plants instead of the harmful soil organisms. So we need water as a solvent to move nutrients from the soil up into the plant. These nutrients and chemicals form elements for plant growth, and we need that water to move in the plants so that they can move these nutrients throughout the plant and maintain turgor in the plant so it can be productive. So water is a key factor in our soil profile. And movement, water is stored and moved by either cohesion or adhesion. This is just showing water cohesive to each other, but then the water adheres to the soil particles, and that's our water holding capacity, whether it's the clay component in our soil or the organic matter that's adhering to. As it adheres to our soil particles, it'll hold it there for the plant to use. And then our soil water characteristics based upon soil texture. The loam soil that I talked about is the perfect soil in many respects because of one aspect, the water holding capacity. If you look at what's available to the plant, it makes most higher percent of its water available to the plant that it can hold. Wilting coefficient, that line represents when the plants would start wilting because the water below that is adhered to the soil so tightly, it's hard for the plant to remove. Fill capacity, the upper line is what will drain out of the tile line or leach or move down into the soil deeper than what the roots are. So that's the water the soil cannot hold on to. So we need to remember wet soils have little to no oxygen, not healthy for plants. And working the soil when it's too wet can cause compaction in that scenario. Working the soil when it's too dry may destroy soil structure. If the soil becomes powdery after tillage, the structure has been destroyed. And the concern there is you can get a crusting layer when the soil is in that powdery form that could then not let water to move into the soil. Okay, this is a fun topic that we talk about when we talk about basic soils components, and it's an important one. It's the cation exchange capacity. So it's the ability of the soil to hold on to positively charged nutrients so that it adheres to the soil itself. Clay and organic matter add the cation exchange capacity to the soil. Giving that negative charge to the soil so it can hold on to the anions and then cations. pH is less of a factor in soils with heavy clay and higher organic matter content. So that's because in those soils, the cation exchange capacity is so large, it's hard to change the soil's pH. So it remains very stable in those type of soils. But in soils that have a low cation exchange capacity, such as a sand soil or a sandy loam, it's going to be easier to change the pH because it has a less of ability to hold on to calcium, which is a cation. You can see the Ca with 2 pluses, and then Mg is magnesium, and K plus would be potassium. NH would be ammonium, which is held onto the soil until it becomes is changed by soil to another molecule. This is again just showing a picture of we got a clay particle in our organic matter. It has many holding sites on those particles that can hold on to the cations and make it available to be available to plants. And we'll talk a little bit how this is important for soil fertility next week. So you can see that mainly it's these 2 components in our soil that add this cation exchange capacity. So we have a real sandy soil. We're going to have to manage it totally different than we would a loam soil, or a soil that actually would be like a clay loam, or a soil that has or an organic soil that has these cation exchange capacity particles in them that provide that charge to the soil. One time, what I did was I had a sandy soil in southern Indiana that I put out some weed seeds, and I grew up, I told you, on a Napanee loam soil, so I was used to fertilizing a Napanee loam soil. I did the worst thing ever. I didn't read label directions, and I just fertilized those weed seedlings in a weed plot to show different weeds that grew in southern Indiana. I just went ahead and fertilized that sandy soil as I would have my Napanee loam soil. I killed all those seedlings because all the fertilizer, because there was no cation exchange capacity, no adhesion to the soil, it's a sandy soil, it all went in the soil in water environment, and the salt index actually killed the roots of those seedlings. Now, if I would have done that like I did on my Napanee loam soil, no problem, they would have grown fine. But I didn't account for the difference in this cation exchange capacity when I fertilized that sandy soil in southern Indiana. You can do that right at here in northern Indiana. We got plenty of sandy soils here too. So a range of this measurement, which is on a soil test, of 1 to 10 would indicate a high sand content. Nitrogen and potassium leaching likely, because we don't have ability to hold on to the potassium or the ammonia form of nitrogen. Less lime to correct pH, and more sensitive to excessive lime applied, which could drive the pH very high. Physical ramifications of the soil with high sand content when we over fertilize. Low water holding capacity. So these soils will not get through a typical growing season most summers without supplemental water. So in a range of 11 to 50, high clay content or organic matter, more lime required to correct the soil pH, greater capacity to hold on to nutrients and give a soil in soil depth. Physical ramifications of the soil with a high clay content, it will have a very tight soil and can be a challenge to manage because of that tightness. High water holding capacity, but not high. If it's high in clay, it's not high water releasing capacity to the plants, which can be an issue. So when we want to know our soils, there's many different soil types in Indiana. Thus, this map that shows these diversification of soils in our state. We have different soils such as sandstone, limestone, shell form soils, with different components as they break down. You can see in southern Indiana, that pink area, that's where those are our oldest soils in the state of Indiana. Well, that's where the last glacier event did not occur in the state of Indiana. And here in northern Indiana, we tend to have younger soils because we had the full impact of all the glaciers that moved through the state. And then just different types of soil. So we need to know what soil is that we're working with. I thought I would show the Marshall County farm field located at the 20th Road south of Argus site. We had our 2016 Indiana State Soil Judging Contest. This was collected from the NRCS soil website. If we go to that site, you can put in your address and bring up your property, and you can create an area of interest. There's a button that's easy to do, and you can then go to the soils site on that webpage, and it'll tell you what soils you have on your property. And I'll show you the information you'll get from it here in a second. So in this soil, there's a lot of diversity. We have loam soils. We have a muck soil, which is at least 20% organic matter. We have a sandy loams, which is the type of soil that riddles, is the type of soil that I have on my property predominantly. And we even have a tiner loamy sand. So we can look at some of these and see how diverse they are. So first of all, this shows you productivity of the soils. Dark blue is good, high productive soils. Light blue are good productive soils. Green is more of a medium soil in production. The yellow, we're starting to have issues when we get to the yellow. And the red is a soil you do not want. It's the best way to put it. It's going to be a low productive soil. So, well, actually, I'll show you that one, the red one, and why it's a low productive soil. It's actually not what makes up the soil. It's the location and topography that causes it to be a low productive soil. So that tiner loamy sand, it had some slope to it. It'll tell us that here on when we pull up that soil properties. It tells you that it is an outwash plains. So this was created as that water was moving away from the glaciers as they melted. And as that water slowed down, it deposited this sand material that was the parent material to create the soil. So we learned that. We can see that 41 to 81 inches, actually 20 inches down to 80 inches is just sand. No changes in soil structure. And it's loamy sand where we incorporated some organic matter into that soil. So this is a very well-drained soil. It doesn't have a restrictive layer for 80 inches down into the soil. It has good drainage capacity, 6 to 20 inches per hour. And depth to water table is 80 inches. And it has a water holding capacity is 4.7 inches. So that's where the issue is with this soil. We need over 20 inches, depending on the crop in the growing season, to grow our plants. So even if we have good soil moisture at the start of the season, we're going to need supplemental rains for irrigation to grow a crop on this soil.
That didn't happen this year, right?
So yeah, well, yeah, parts of last year for sure. So here's a picture of the tiner loam soil. You can see that upper soil profile is darker. That's why it's a sandy loam, loamy sand, I should say. It's a loamy sand. Still high sand content, but it does have some organic matter that's allowing it to have better soil properties and better water holding capabilities in the upper soil, where you can see it goes from that loamy sand to just pure sand. Advantage of the soil would be growing special crops that you place in irrigation and fertilize multiple in the year, because we don't We have good drainage, so the root systems can have an environment where they tend not to have water saturation issues impacting root health. So some specialty crops and some plants like grapes that root deep, this is not a bad soil to have if you can supplement the moisture needs of the plant. That's why a lot of specialty crops are actually grown on more sandy soils. So looking at this Waterford Coacha loam, it's got 0 to 2% loams. This is a landform, it's a floodplain, so this is where flooding occurs. That's the issue with the soil. It's actually, the soil is made up of eroded soil components from higher levels, eroding down and collecting in this floodplain. If you look at the structure of the soil, the upper 8 inches is that what I call a perfect soil, a loam. And it's a fine sandy loam, a loamy sand. And then the bottom, it's actually a gravelly coarse sand. So if this would not have been in a floodplain, this could have been a productive soil with what the textures that make up the soil and the structures that would be in the soil if it was at a higher elevation. So depth of the restricted feature is 40 to 70 inches. But if it could have the ability to drain, it has decent drainage, 2 to 6 inches per hour. Depth to water table is high, 6 to 18 inches, so it would not be a good place to plant anything that's deep rooted. And then the real issue is it has a frequency of flooding. So even if you have something actively growing in that shallow soil layer, it could be killed with flooding in many years. But being this type of a soil structure, it still doesn't have a great water holding capacity. In this case, that's not the issue. We're going to get the water. This is probably too much of it. 5.7 inches water holding capacity. So this is showing that soil. You can see it's dark. The upper part is because of organic matter, but it's dark throughout because the iron's reduced. So this is an indication of poor drainage, is the color of the soil. Poor drainage because it gets flooded quite frequently and the water table is high. So the iron is reduced. Now look at an Adrian muck, an organic soil, 20% organic matter or higher. These soils had to be drained or they would not have been farmable. So this is a depression on an outwash plains area. Fair material, herbaceous, organic material over a sandy outwash. So that's where we're getting that muck. And then down deep, it's sand. You can see depth to water table is 0 inches because without draining the soil, that's why the organic matter is present. It was a situation that was not having oxygen readily available to the soil microbes, so they were not able to break down the organic matter. The drainage is variable. What's nice about the soil and why it's one of the more productive soils when it's drained is the water holding capacity. It can hold, when properly at its water holding capacity at the start of the growing season, it has a majority of the water needed to grow the crop being held in the soil. So with supplemental rains, it can easily produce a crop without irrigation. So you can see the darkness of that soil, the Adrian muck, drained. And then what happens actually to even our muck soils, once drained, we'll start losing some of that organic matter over time because once oxygenated, the soil organism population due to this abundant organic matter will spike up in that soil profile and start cycling the organic matter. So that's the highlights of what I wanted to share. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have any questions? That's the unmute. If you're online, you can type a question into the chat box that's available. And I'll go online and show you how to get to the NRCS soil webpage, since we have a little time here.
Is that what you did?
I need a-
Different sites, so I don't know which one. This one should go maybe the same.
You can just type in NRCS, soil survey.
I need to share that.
Soil survey.
Mhm.
Put in your address. I'm on there, but I can't figure out how to actually get to that.
Share screen.
You know, I'm not even at a point where I can see it now.
Oh, you're talking about this map on
And
seven?
then the NRCS.
Oh.
I was talking about. Yeah, the colored one.
This one here,
Yeah.
at the bottom of seven?
Those
Oh, that map?
kind of go together.
Where you can see your own
And
property.
that beacon.
Oh, yeah.
This is property.
Mhm.
And then
What's that webpage?
it's the NRCS.
So
Dot USDA.gov.
NRCS.
Dot USDA.gov.
Okay.
No, I share that again. I'll share.
And then he colored it on.
Nice. Good coloring.
Well,
He stayed in the line.
Yes, very good. He
Which is
probably
rare
had his
for me.
grandchild do it, huh?
yeah.
Yeah, they can do
Need help
so
with,
better.
Internet
Oh my
or
gosh.
coloring it up.
There we go.
What?
So if you just Google soil, NRCS soil web survey. Ah, it's being technical there. Let's go back.
Simplified.
So you get this green button, you press on that magic green button, and it takes you right to it. Then all you go to is address, you click on address, put in your address.
Yeah.
It eventually pops up up there, up to the right.
And then it just zooms you right into that address. And then all you have to do is this area of interest and draw a box around what you want to look at. We draw it around Indiana Berry.
That is cool.
And then what you do is you go to the soil map. And it'll give you the soils on that property.
How are they achieving that information? Strictly by
They
video?
do a soil surveys, is actually meaning they go out and bore holes in the soil in a what they call a soil series area, which changes soils based upon topography. So they don't like soil every acre, they soil areas in that topography of a soil series. Then they estimate what all the soils are in that site. So they don't, we couldn't afford for them to test
Right,
every
that's right.
acre, but they do
So they're
test.
combined using
Yeah.
Visual and samples.
and samples, and they're not always that accurate. That's why you should at least go ahead and fill your soil, make sure it's what they're saying it is. But for example, right here is that Riddle series soil. And then here's one of our best soils. Back here, this is a Rensselaer loam soil, one of our best soils in the county. So if you click on that, it will give you all the soil properties you want to know about that soil. So again, here it's going to tell you those components I was showing, and it can be printable, just by clicking on that.
When that was done,
Yeah, they just finished redoing it. So then you have all those properties of your soil. So, a loam soil like that is going to have different properties than some other soils. It can hold 10.7 inches of water. That's one benefit of that loam soil.
can you tell anywhere from the time they did it to previous to now, how much change there was in it?
That's why routinely they do new soil surveys, because we exist. We change soils.
We changed it.
Like in
yeah.
southern Indiana where they mine soils, all those soils forever change once they've been mined. They no
Yeah.
longer have the original soil properties.
So it's
then-
constant change.
Yeah, and then we can go this Data Explorer and learn about these soils. For example, if I want vegetation productivity, I click on there. I want to grow black walnut trees. Oh, that's from Missouri, so this probably won't work here, but we'll see if it will. Yeah.
Cool.
So that green area is better for growing walnut trees than what I said what my perfect loam soil was. And that's because they need better drainage to grow trees because they're deeper rooted. That's the issue there. So this, so depending on what you want to grow, they'll tell you if it's a better soil to grow it or
Oh,
not.
that's pretty cool.
Nice.
So we can just, if you're wanting to plant walnut trees,
That's, how we're the blueberry capital here. Is the soil all over the county pretty good for blueberries? Is that-
no, it has to be what it used to be. So if I go back, that type of a soil is just across this highway. That's where Sam grows his blueberries. It needs to be one of those, blueberries grow best in like a bog area close to a saturated area.
They like
Just-
water.
They like water and low pH because of their roots. The roots are not developed to take drought stress. Actually, is one. So if you grow a blueberry, you need to supplement it with water if it's getting really dry, because they don't have as many fine roots as what other plants do because of where they grew. They tend to grow in areas that the soil wasn't
So
limiting on
blueberries
moisture.
were not natural for this area? They were-
Blueberries?
Yeah.
Oh, we had huge blueberry areas, which were bogs. It was kind of that, not the saturated area, but the area close to it. After the Civil War, there was a huge blueberry natural harvest area close to Walkerton, Indiana, by Coons Lake. It was a huge area, and they would harvest those blueberries and ship them on train to New York City.
Really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
But the negative thing about bogs is being a high percent organic matter, it caught on fire and burnt that natural area.
Oh, and so it totally changed the aspect of
Yeah,
the soil.
it killed all those existing plants because one challenge when you have a lot of organic matter, if it catches on fire, it's hard to put it out.
Oh, yeah.
That's very interesting. There was a huge, blueberry around Coons Lake.
Oh.
I think I remember hearing about that.
And then because of.
I did not know that.
I
Very
did
cool.
not either.
So
That's from Washington.
But for your
I think it's
information,
just to tell, like, we're wanting to plant more trees on our property for
Sure.
various reasons. And so this year will actually tell me which trees would populate the best.
it does give you what is the better soil types for woodlands, is part of this. And it's not necessarily what's the best site for gardens, because gardens are an annual crop that grows in a growing season. So we don't worry about if it in the off, you gotta think about off-season for trees. If it tends to accumulate water and the water table goes up in the wintertime for a perennial crop like trees.
I planted a fig tree last year, because I love fig trees in the south, and I wanted to plant one. Well, it apparently did not survive the winter. So, which I didn't even think about location on my property, which varies dramatically on 9 acres. And. so,
Sure does.
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to go get another tree and figure out what's the best place to plant it.
And then you gotta make sure it's winter, you gotta make sure it's was it a winter hardy fig?
Yeah, it was a Chicago fig.
A
which is
Chicago
supposed to-
fig?
It's supposed to be hardy for up here. I did at least research that much.
Well, that's good. You even can check to see if it's a good site for septic fields.
Oh, wow.
I should check that first.
And look at all the red.
That's
Oh,
not good soil.
no, that's no.
So neither of these soils are good for septic systems. So that's one of our challenges when we live in a rural areas is finding a soil that we don't have to do modified septic systems that are more expensive.
Yeah.
It's not that you couldn't put one on these soils. It'd have to be like a mound system or something like that.
Which is.
Well, they're a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, they're a whole Wisconsin, but we're on the lakes. But we trade per.
So the homework is to go to the soil webpage and just research your soil. And, you know, is it a soil that you need to amend? Is it a soil you're going to need to irrigate? Is it a soil that meets the needs of what you want to grow? Kind of do some research and answer some questions. And then we can have a discussion on that when we get back to the classroom next week.
Well, the reason I have my soil test because my plants did not do well last year. And I kept thinking, is it soil or is it sun? I have to admit that it's probably sun, but I wanted to test the soil first, so I didn't have to either move my site or cut down a tree. So anyway, that's where I began. And now I'm interested in knowing if it's that tree that grew up. And now I have trouble. So we will
Do
see.
y'all do soil testing here at the, if I bring my soil in? y'all do
Which,
that?
what we do is we kind of act as a go-between, you know, so what I can do is, you know, it costs, it costs $16 to mail it there, and then they send a sample or a result back, and I can tell you how, we'll talk about how we would use that next week to do soil adjustments, fertility adjustments. Or you can have them send back a recommendation, which would cost $20 for the sample plus the monthly. So, and it's we want to do it every 3 years, ideally,
Oh, really?
if we are maintaining our soil fertility. If you're making, and then the type of soil you may want to test more often. If you have a low holding soil, low CE soil, you don't have a lot of clay or organic matter in your soil, it's going to need closer watching to make sure you're maintaining your fertility level. Or if you want to make adjustments, you don't want to make a big adjustment. So you may want to come back the next year and make sure if it's at the right spot. Before
I'm
you,
assuming
That's what I'm
soil.
going to do.
So if you have, doing raised, I have raised beds,
yes.
so, is that the same, do you want to test that?
Oh,
Every
raise,
so often, or?
you're going to add some just non-soil to that mix that probably has a slow release fertilizer the first year.
Yeah, that's what I did first.
And then you're going to need to then supplement with maybe even just something that has some micronutrients in it.
What about sand? I wanted to, you know, when you buy the organic garden soil or whatever, it's like a peat. And some of that, like you said, the water just like runs.
It
off
could
of
be peat, it can be cotton fiber, it can be multiple things that are not
So I
really
added some
soil.
sand to the
Mhm.
soil and everything, but does the sand, what kind of sand? I mean, is some of the sand the bag sand that you buy, or some of them treated with,
No, the back sand is just,
it's just,
we have a Chelsea soil in Marshall County that if you pulled up and you dug it up, it'd just be pure sand. You just need to screen
I
it to
think
get the
I live
stuff
in
out, and
town.
that's kind of what they sell.
And I think most of my
Bags.
backyard was fill, dirt and rock, so it's like, that's why I ended up doing raised beds.
Yes, and that's the issue of construction sites. Any house, many construction sites, what they do is they take the good topsoil or part of it away when they dig the basement, then spread out the clay layer, lower soil components that lower in organic matter, that's what gets spread out on top of the soil. If you're living in a house that's 50 years old, that's probably no longer
Yeah.
impacting you.
My goal.
But if it's a newer house, that you want to just check that out. Or if you're actually having a house built for you, what it costs to build a house, be sure to tell them to leave your topsoil behind. You want it.
Yeah, it's a like 1928 bungalow, so, but
Sure.
I noticed that my backyard and everything, I have a good sized backyard, but I noticed that it's like, since I've been there, it's like.
So if you're not hearing our discussion clearly, we're talking about a town soil where is more, they did not leave a good quality soil behind after construction. And we're doing raised beds. So with the raised bed, you're probably gonna have soil, but half of it's gonna be non-soil, mixing it to make sure you have good drainage. So you gotta probably have to be more supplementing each year with fertilizer. At lower levels when you fertilize, don't do a one big fertilization because it's not gonna hold on to the nutrients.
I do compost.
Compost would be a good thing to add. And we'll talk about that because compost is a natural way to increase organic matter and add nutrients.
I have one more
Yes.
question.
I noticed that Lowe's, they always sell varieties of soil and what have you. They actually have bags of, I'll say soil, for lack of a better tough word or whatever. It specifically says for raised beds.
Yeah, I bought one bag of that last week. and
What
it
they
was-
call soil, we're talking about what they sell at Lowe's, they call soil, many times it's actually compost.
Yeah,
And it's not true soil, which is good. That's why it works for raised beds. It's actually a
But it was just
compost.
surprising to see this particular bag that says for raised beds. But, okay, there's a special
I
order
bought one,
up here
so I
or
want
what?
to check it out.
Yeah. Well, it's probably, it will have good drainage properties. With raised beds, there's two kinds of raised beds, and we'll talk about that in more detail, but one that you construct that's actually tall. You want to mix in some actual soil with compost or something, so you don't want to, just like a potted plant, you don't want to just use soil because it gets compacted from all the watering. Same way with a raised bed, you're going to have to supplement, water it enough that if it's just a soil in that raised high bed, it would have compaction issues.
Okay, I was just putting that out there because I just thought that was really kind of funny. In its own way, this is particular for this,
So they can sell it for $1
Yeah.
or two more.
or less more.
I buy violets.
Yeah, sorry about that line that was in the PowerPoint. We had so much trouble from the start. We actually tested it out yesterday. We were trying to be proactive.
And we didn't see the slideshow. We just looked at our papers.
You didn't see it up there?
We
No,
didn't
not
see
at
that
all.
was there after every
All the time.
But that's okay, as long as Ken can see it, 'cause he doesn't have paper.
I know, it's really teeny.
I thought.
I
tried using my phone. I can see all the state pictures, that's why I couldn't
Uh-huh.
see.
The last few times I used to shop for a month. And, I had so
Now,
many
how do I
things
unmute
that-
everybody?
That like a week later, so now when I shop, I think about my magnifying glass and check all my things. There's something you're buying.
Yeah.
Cherry.
Yeah.
We look at Menards and all that, yeah.
I think next week, I'm going to just give you that are on Zoom the right to unmute yourself if you have questions. That way you can have a better interaction with us during the presentation and during this period.
We want to hear your questions too.
Because there's not that many of
I
us.
had one. You
Is there any other questions? The keys to soil property is knowing the soil that you have, its drainage properties, its ability to hold on to nutrients. So you can put together a fertility plan that we'll talk about next week. And also how you can amend it to improve it over time. And also, when you get into selecting plants for a site, it needs to match up with that soil. If it's a higher water table, there are plants like grapes, you do not want to plant at that site, and fruit trees. You know, it needs to have a deeper soil to grow in than if it tends to be flooded in the winter. I had someone that I highly respected that planted trees along Highway 331, and he was saying, well, it never floods in those low areas during the growing season. Well, that a perennial plant has to live through winter too and spring, and it may be fine during the growing season, but when we get all that higher water accumulation in wintertime and low evaporation, the soil can become saturated in those lower areas that don't have as much issues during the growing season. So we want to think about season long with perennial plants.
One of the weirdest things when we moved up here was how the water table actually comes above you can actually see the water table up here. In Louisiana, it doesn't change like that. It's always.
Well, that
in
tiner
the-
loam,
We thought it was flooding, but no, it's
Yeah.
actual water.
it's a water table. It's kind of funny because on Highway 6, someone bought the house now and filled in the hole. The person was trying to have a pond. Well, in the spring of the year, the water is up to the top of the pond.
Yes, yeah.
And then by July, there was no water in the pond because it was just the water table fluctuating in that soil
That's the way our
profile.
pond is, and our pond is really low, really low. I've never seen it this low this time of year.
So
It's
if
always
you,
almost that crest.
yes. So if you're relying on the water table to fill your pond, you better seal it and just fill it in another way. So it's not the water table filling your pond. A liner, but that's also issue. See, that would be a horrible soil for a perennial tree to be growing in because it's gonna be totally saturated in the spring. You know, and that's not good for, unless it's a bald cypress that creates these knobs that allows the tree to get oxygen when it's saturated. You know, so there's some trees that adapt to that. And in this example I was talking about, he even did make that adjustment, and those trees survived that could handle that saturated environment on the highway. So you got to adjust maybe the tree you plant that can handle that high water table. But if you have that tiner soil, you'll never see the water table because it's 80 inches above it, you know. So there's some of our soils that's why they work better for specialty crops because they can't take wet feet, you know. So that's what they grow our seed corn on, and all of our potatoes and tomatoes and those kind of crops are on soils that don't have that water table issue.
I see myself doing some research
Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, then if you have one of those really low areas that's totally saturated in the spring of the year and you can't grow much into it, that's a great place to put in a rain garden. Putting in plants that can tolerate wet soils and allow it just to do its thing to kind of clean our water up before it goes into the soil.
Now, we usually watch a certain area on our property, and if the water table starts getting up there, I know my basement's fixing to flood. So I don't even have to go to the bank, oh, better go check it. Yeah, watching the lane.
Well, that's can be our issues with our basements.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's getting close to 1:30. Unless there's additional questions, we'll close out for this week, and looking forward to see you next week talking about soil test and fertility.
All right, thank you.
And next week, those on Zoom, we won't mute you.